All right. I know everybody's got somewhere to be and something to do. I've been told on 20 different occasions walking in here. But we're going to go through this thing fairly rapidly. This is the full committee of the rules, and the rules are that the questions are from this committee, if there are any. Mr. Golick is going to take the mic now, and he's going to go through the latest version of 142 and 143. Mr. Golick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have in front of you two substitutes. One is, and they were sent out last night, but you've also got it here. The staff has provided. House Bill 142 is LC 256181S, and then House Bill 143 is LC 256162S. What I thought I would do in the interest of time, I understand, and as the chair mentioned, people have commitments. It's an odd hour to be meeting. What I'm going to do is just very quickly go through some changes that are not many, frankly, between the subcommittee. Of course, that draft has been out that substitute has been out for a while, and now. What the author wanted us to communicate very clearly is that we're not voting on this today. This is really more by way of update in terms of how these drafts have changed, why they've changed, and it's all part of our process, like any other bill, of consideration, listening, getting some constructive feedback, and then making changes accordingly. This is really no different, and the author was vehement in his position that this should be no different, and that we need to go ahead and get the latest version out, the latest thinking out, and then use that really as a platform for members, whether they're on the committee or not on the committee, to provide feedback to the author, to the members of this committee, to leadership, whoever. And the author was equally vehement about wanting to receive that feedback from members, and however they're comfortable in doing so. And that's the way it ought to be with any piece of reform legislation. So what I wanted to do just very quickly is to go through whatever changes are there. I may highlight a change from the subcommittee just because they're important. I'll start with House Bill 143, which is the quicker one. There are really no changes between the subcommittee and now. I understand that folks here weren't necessarily members of the subcommittee. We still have, in House Bill 143, our friends on the local level filing locally in terms of campaign finance disclosures. On line 123, there's a significant change. It's not really significant, but it's an administrative change to take note of. It strikes the March 31 campaign disclosure report requirement for an election year. The reason why we're doing that is because if you read later on down, starting on line 131, there's a new requirement that right now you report funds that are contributed through December 31st, right? But we also have fundraising that occurs between January 1 and the time we go into session the second Monday in January. Those to this point are not reported until after the March 31 deadline. So what the author wanted to do in the interest of additional disclosure, is within X number of 5 days of the convening of the General Assembly to report all those contributions, if any, that have been collected between January 1 and the convening of the General Assembly, which makes sense from a timely disclosure standpoint. But if we go ahead and do that, then it makes the March 31 disclosure duplicative and unnecessary. Why? Because we're in session. That's it. You can't raise money during the session, obviously, and it makes the March 31 disclosure just an administratively duplicative piece of work. So we went ahead and struck that, and just want to let you know the impetus for that. But the significant piece of that really is the disclosure, the new January disclosure. On lines 5 and 6, we kept I don't know if I'd call it staggered, but certainly trying to make it more administratively easy for our friends at the local level to file different levels of disclosure in terms of when they have to disclose, so it's not too much of a repetitive process for them. Obviously, the amounts that we're talking about are lower and that really warrants perhaps a more relaxed filing schedule in order to encourage a culture of compliance, because that's really what we're trying to get to, is a culture of compliance. Beginning on lines 153 through 179, if our local friends they have contributions of 0 to 2,500, that's one schedule. 2,500 to 5,000, that's another schedule. And 5,000 plus, that's another schedule. And again, that's no change from the subcommittee. That really, in terms of significant provisions in that bill, that's really it. What I'd like to do, Mr. Chairman, is just transition directly, in the interest of time, over to House Bill 142. And there aren't a significant number of changes, but the changes that have been made, I think we should take note of and be aware of. No changes as it relates to the commission. We're still restoring the commission's powers, which has always been the original intent. As it relates to expenditures, this comes from the subcommittee substitute, but I do think it's important to repeat again that for purposes of exemptions on the food and beverage spending, what we did is what's emerged is a pattern of carving out some exemptions for those functions that really are once-a-year events. And what are we talking about? Sometimes there are committee luncheons or committee dinners. There could be standing subcommittee dinners, not necessarily here at the Capitol, but also at home. Chamber of Commerce events, hospital authority, that type of thing. Those are generally once-a-year things, if at all. The author thought that, well, that's fairly reasonable. That's part of our official duties, and having those relationships. This is a people business. Having those contacts, and thought, for purposes of again the culture of compliance, that was a sort of a common sense exception on how we address that kind of spending. There was a question that was brought up by Chairman Smyre and the Minority Leader, Ms. Abrams, in the subcommittee regarding caucuses, the Rural Caucus, Legislative Black Caucus. We have a few other, I'll call them established caucuses that we've had. They're regional lines, political lines, partisan lines, whatever it may be, that are long established caucuses in this House, and they're extremely important to members because they unify members on a bipartisan basis. I know the Rural Caucus is extremely important to my sweet mate Jay Roberts, and I can understand why, because rural issues are different. They're different than what they are in suburban Atlanta, and we need to be sensitive to that. The author is sensitive to it, and there's an ongoing conversation about how do we address those caucuses in terms of their meetings and how they conduct their business. I wanted to make sure, she's not here, she had to leave, and I know Chairman Smyre did too, but I wanted to make sure I said it out loud, that we're looking at the proper mechanism for consideration of those caucuses, those legitimate caucuses, and a procedural mechanism whereby those caucuses continue doing what they're doing, bringing people together across partisan lines, but just making sure that we have an internal process standard for approval of those caucuses, so that Mr. Willard and I don't walk out the door and form a caucus. Just legitimacy and just finding the procedural dynamics that go along with that. As it relates to lines 77 to 88, this has to do with any exemptions. Of course, we keep the food and beverage ban in terms of that lobbyist spending. There have been some carve-outs for that, and there's been some adjustments. We do take out, I should say, remove from any sort of lobbyist spending air travel. That's a significant takeout. Lodging is kept in, and travel, you can see line 79 and forward. These have to do also, and I don't think it was by design, I think it's just sort of organically grown into that a lot of these functions or conferences that may occur are once-a-year events. They could be a chamber event, they could be a local event with a school board, it could be a conference of an association, let's say, but they're generally once-a-year events, if at all, and it allows a member to go ahead and attend those as part of their, of course, they have to be directly related to their official duties. And it's pretty self-explanatory. But again, I think the stress that I would place on it is the fact that by and large, if not uniformly, these things are once a year as opposed to being repetitive throughout the year. The other significant change that I think is very important and is a direct product of the feedback that we've gotten through the committee process has to do with the whole who is a lobbyist issue. What we wanted to do was, again, fostering a culture of compliance in terms of if you're here lobbying, not for yourself, but on behalf of an organization, whether you're a volunteer, working pro bono, or if you're paid, you have to register. We have to know who we're dealing with, and if an individual comes here and says, I'm so-and-so and I represent the Georgia Association of fill in the blank, that individual is lobbying on behalf of an organization and ought to be registered. However, there are individuals who come down here on behalf of an organization who are, they're volunteer organizations, they're working pro bono, there could be a citizen activist group, whatever it may be, but it's still an organization. We arrived at the conclusion, or the author has arrived at the conclusion that what we don't want to do is to have a situation where, yes, those people register, they're not making any lobbyist expenditures by any means. They're really taking money out of their own pocket in order to go ahead and lobby for their organizations. What we don't want to do is set up a gotcha situation with these reporting requirements. So they're not making any lobbyist expenditures, but if they miss a filing deadline, even though they're not making any expenditures, they still get fined. Well, that doesn't really seem to make sense. So what the author wanted to do was to propose for your consideration now and into the next several days, a mechanism beginning on line 252, so that those individuals who are acting pro bono, who don't make any lobbying expenditures, yes, they have to register, and we've reduced the lobbyist registration fee down to $25, and that's applied across the board for everyone, whether you're a paid lobbyist, not paid, pro bono, whatever it may be, a uniform requirement, $25. However, if you're an individual who's acting pro bono and not making lobbying expenditures, we've set up a mechanism whereby those individuals don't have reporting requirements, so they don't get into that gotcha situation that I described a few minutes ago. If they start making expenditures, then certainly they have to go ahead and do their reporting, the regular reporting like others do. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So that was the compromise we tried to strike. Uniform registration, transparency, people, if they're lobbying for an organization, they register, but having a sensitivity about the fact that we don't want to set people up for failure in terms of the reporting requirement. So hopefully we've struck that balance on it. That is really it, Mr. Chairman. I think I do want to highlight the fact that on the exemptions, I want to make sure it's clear that we still have the situation. Individual comes down here and they're lobbying for themselves. They can come down here for every day, talk to every committee, be outside on the rope line talking to members every day on behalf of themselves, and of course they never have to register, pursuant to their First Amendment right. We do have the same provision as we had in the last substitute, lines 287 to 290, where we want to make allowances for those individuals who are, say, here for, I use the Nurses' Day example, 500 people downstairs or all around this Capitol in white coats. Maybe the pharmacists, they were here today, right? We don't want to have a situation where those individuals, they may be here for the organization. They may be speaking for the organization. They may be speaking for themselves. We don't want to have a situation where they obviously need to be caught up and register as a lobbyist. That's ridiculous. So we want to have a situation for legislative days, for a certain number of days, for those individuals to come down, lobby on behalf of themselves or an organization, and not be subject to the lobbying requirements. The 5 days seem to be a good middle ground, a reasonable common sense ground on the number of days. I've not personally heard any pushback on that, since it tends to strike a balance, especially when you consider the fact that we're respecting the individual and proposing balance on the reporting requirements. The other exceptions have not changed since the subcommittee substitute. I personally have not gotten any real pushback on that at all. I think, again, there's some common sense in there. So, Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there. The author wanted me to make sure it was very clear that this is it's the next iteration. It's a substitute. It is, however, subject to feedback, criticism, public and private. He understands that and welcomes the feedback. However, individual members would like to pursue that, welcome the suggestions, and has really tried to strike a balance in this proposal and move the ball forward as it relates to compliance and, of course, the greater issue of public trust. I'll try to answer, Mr. Chairman, I don't know what your time schedule is, but I'm on your schedule.
Thank you, Mr. Golick. Mr. Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Golick, just want to emphasize a couple things based on what different groups have come to me on. I want to make sure that they know that we've heard them. At line 77 regarding travel, that section, not only are we excluding for anyone the reimbursement for air travel, but underneath this section, only the representative and a staff member, individuals, travel expenses can be covered, correct? So no family members' travel will be reimbursable.
That's right.
And you alluded to it, but I think a lot of folks who are sort of flipping through it at this time regarding coming to the Capitol and expressing your personal views, I think that's important to point out. That's at line 283 of the bill. That makes it clear that you can come down here at any time. And I'm just sort of pointing out the section because I know some people were asking me about that down there. And I appreciate your work, the work of this committee also regarding beginning at line 252, that makes it simpler for citizen lobbyists who are not receiving any kind of reimbursement or making any expenses. All they got to do is file once a year an affidavit to that effect, and they don't have to make any other filings.
Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of clarification, just to make sure I understand the potential gotcha moment. If I happen to have a friend and constituent, may or may not be relative, whether a constituent or not, that I've had a relationship for a long time, of which myself and that person enjoy playing golf. Let's say we play golf. He happens to be a registered lobbyist, but we just go play golf. And we pay for our own golf. And I happen to not notice that a Coca-Cola or water was put in my cart when the cart, my point is that going to, it had nothing to do with lobbying, but I ended up receiving a Coca-Cola on the golf course playing with a registered lobbyist. I just want to understand, is that a gotcha moment, or I happen to not have a sleeve of golf balls. He says, here, hit this $3 Titleist. $3. Just trying to clarify that, please.
I appreciate the question, and it gets back to a line of thought that I really should have said previously. We can try to write this as tightly as possible, and I can sit here and guarantee you that there will be some sort of hole somewhere under the category. We just can't think of everything. I think a lot of that comes down to, and the author was clear on this as well, that at some point there is an element of good faith. That at some point there is an element of what your intent is and what that individual's intent is at that time. I would also not hesitate to fall back on the fact that that's why we have an ethics commission. And that's why we have an ethics commission, hopefully, that will show discretion and judgment as it relates to what did somebody's conduct really amount to and what didn't it amount to.
Okay, and just make sure you understand, so there's really not a distinction whether it's a lobbying activity or whether it's outside that. That really doesn't matter.
I'd want to check on the exact wording as it relates to if it's a promotional item, something that's de minimis. But I'd want to go ahead and take a look at that more closely before I give you a definitive answer, because I don't want to tell you something that's not true. To the extent that we can close that, we have. To the extent that we need to close that further, we would, understanding that we do need to have some common sense in there as well. But I appreciate the sensitivity on it, because that's not something that we're trying to get to.
And I know that's not what we're doing, but
right.
No offense, but there are people out there looking for those gotcha moments, and I just want to be aware of what we
there are. And it depends on would something come under the definition perhaps in line 56 of a promotional item, or something maybe, or something, produced in Georgia. Those are all little examples of, what does something really qualify as? And at some point, you're going to have a judgment call on something. It's really what we're really trying to get into. And I think the author's intent is really not to hair split. And I'm not taking issue with anything you've said. I hear you loud and clear, and we all do. But really getting into the big ticket items of larger expenditures.
Madam Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did want to just mention publicly how much I appreciate the author and the subcommittee's work on this and listening to all different folks from all over the state. I did want to mention in the other bill, House Bill 143, on line 131, I believe the author's first year speaker, we made a slight modification to what level of contribution had to be reported. I believe it was contributions of $100 or more.
Tell me where you are, Madam Pro Tem. I'm sorry.
House Bill 143, line 131.
Okay.
You may want to consider changing that to contributions of $100 or more. It's a dollar's difference, but it makes it consistent with our other reporting requirements.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the author, or to the subcommittee chairman, on two quick questions. With respect to public sector lobbying, agency individuals that are acting on behalf of their agency, I'm on line 287 of House Bill 142. Any person who is not a public officer or public employee, and this paragraph is in the section where the registration restrictions do not apply to them, so that's how it's constructed. Does this mean that employees of agencies who currently register as lobbyists to do lobbying to the General Assembly on behalf of their agency will not be required to register as a lobbyist?
Well, they do have to register as a lobbyist, but that's the 5 days, so that if somebody's over here for an agency, on behalf of an agency for less than that period, no, that they wouldn't have to.
Okay, so the way this is constructed is, so if you're an employee of an agency that comes down to speak to a committee and your time down here is less than 5 days, you, like a member of the public, would not have to register. But if you're down here consistently throughout a session on behalf of an agency, you do have to register.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and that, we're just trying to meet up with the whole
Sure.
common sense. If you've got an employee, they may be the subject matter expert. Mr. Smith and I are on the insurance committee. If we have a subject matter expert who's coming down to a few hearings from the insurance department, it doesn't make sense to have that individual.
One other quick question, if I could, Mr. Chairman. On lines 349 and 350, want to be very careful. This is the public officer accepting expenditures as defined from a person who's a registered lobbyist. I appreciate the language, no public officer shall with actual knowledge accept. I don't know if we're making some cleanup additions from a person who they have actual knowledge to be a lobbyist. I mean, there's the actual knowledge they accepted something. It wasn't just stuck on their desk. They actually received it. But then there's the actual knowledge that the person's a lobbyist themselves. If I received something from somebody, knowingly received it, but was not aware they were a lobbyist, I don't think we're looking to trap somebody in something
Sure.
like that. To me, actual
Agreed.
knowledge and actual knowledge in both would make it provide some safety that might eliminate some ambiguity.
What was your final point? What was your suggestion on how to change the language?
Was to say, no public officer shall with actual knowledge accept any expenditure of a person who they have actual knowledge to be a lobbyist that's registered.
Just wanted to make sure that the actual knowledge component applied both to
receiving
both to the expenditure
and
the knowledge that the individual was or was not an actual a lobbyist.
Any other member? Okay. There will be another meeting, hopefully next week. We appreciate your time. We're adjourned.